Thank you all for being here, and thank you all for having us. I was going to start us right off, and I'm actually going to, I was telling Sheree I was just so hyped when I saw her because I remember back in the day reading Dark Matter at a point when I was studying, just becoming introduced to this thing called Afrofuturism. Some of y'all don't even remember that. Anyways, I remember starting that in like 98, 99, but then right in 2000, Dark Matter came out. So I know we're talking very on the cusp of things, but I feel like you can't be at a panel discussion with Sheree Renée Thomas and not talk about Dark Matter. So I just wanted to just get us started by talking about trajectories. I mean, you were Dark Matter then. Would you imagine we'd be where we are now, and what things have changed or just surprised you most, or just something that stands out to you about the trajectory of bringing Black writers together?
My journey starts with Dark Matter. Is it on? Hello, all right. My journey with Dark Matter started from a place of personal interest. I was always a science fiction fan. My family was as well. And so we grew up reading that work, and also just from the oral tradition of telling scary stories, hate stories, those kinds of historical tales that are terrifyingly true, and also the magical stuff. And it wasn't until I was in college when I was introduced to the work of Octavia E. Butler, who was a very, very important icon for me personally. I knew that Black people wrote science fiction. I knew Samuel Delany wrote science fiction, though I didn't know he was, at that time I didn't know he was Black. I knew he wrote it, I knew he was gay, let's put it like that, I knew he was queer. But when I started reading Octavia B. Butler, I realized, oh, we were publishing it way more than I thought, like I just didn't know. And reading her work made me want to read everything that I'd been missing. And fast forward, I'm editing fiction at Random House. And what I would read for pleasure, even though I was editing mostly women's fiction and romance, some of the Regency romances, that kind of thing. I started thinking, there's got to be an anthology of short stories from, Black writers from around the world, including Octavia E. Butler's work, who had her own volume out at that time. And I went to a bookstore looking for it, and they didn't have it. And so Dark Matter was a seed that was planted in Memphis. When I think about the work of Dr. Martin and Dr. Miriam DaCosta Willis, who did Ida B. Wells's Diary. They had done a Black erotica anthology. Her board had done Brother Man, and Margaret Busby in England had done Daughters of Africa. And so I was thinking about the power of anthologies. And that's really what Dark Matter did for me, just kind of pulling these stories off my shelf. W.E. Du Bois was on my shelf. I knew he wrote science fiction. They never really discussed it as such. So I was like, he's going in there. And I'm going to get pushed back. But I had no idea that we would be talking about this work, 25 years later, or that we would be talking about African speculative fiction and African futurism. Because at that time, you couldn't really get them to identify with it. They wouldn't call their work science fiction or fantasy, even though a lot of it was speculative. So it's now we have all these great writers who are deeply in the genre, and we're discovering more and more all the time. So yeah.
Thank you so much. I should say this too to you all. At the start of this, I'm always wondering, how did someone get to a place? And so I should say, when Effie was contacting me and said, hey, do you have any ideas about what we might do on a panel trying to merge African and African American, Black American? I was saying, hey, there's this book on Black Panther, and it just came out. And I'm saying, it didn't just come out, but I was just reading it, and I was so excited. So I said, hey, this is an idea. And I was just throwing the idea out there. And then, I don't know, a month or two later, he says, hey, this panel is going to have Suyi on. And it just blew my mind. I think I'm going to have to start asking the universe for more things, because that was just great that he was able to get you here. So I'm really pleased to have you here. He's written many things, but like I say, the thing that really connects us here is we were trying to think about just highlighting the idea of just connections between, let's say, Black American, and in very specific case, Nigerian, or Black American British, or Jamaican, and, list goes on and on. So I just wanted you to say a little bit to get us started about what it means. I know some of us at some point reached a Black Panther fatigue with the movie, but what we didn't talk about is how many writers the odd person here is the person who hasn't written a novel about Black Panther. Both folks have written novels about Black Panther. So I just want you to say something about those connections, what it meant to be jumping around in different ways with that subject matter.
Yeah, I mean, very much like you, when I was invited to write, I was like, another one. Because the property sort of, the Black Panther IP sort of extends, across various media. Started out as comics, but has gone into film, there's animations, there's video games, etc. But the novelizations, though, those ones are new. It's more recent. We haven't had novels, which I found interesting because there's a long history of novelizations of, existing properties, Star Wars, Star Trek, stuff we know and understand to be in that science fiction or speculative fiction realm. So I think that was the first thing that interested me. I was like, okay, the literary object of the novel is one more form that we can extend this, thing into. Which coincidentally, I had already seen, like Sheree's novel came before mine, like years ago. So I was already glad to see like other people were already doing work in this vein. So it's kind of like pulled me in that direction. I think mine might even be slightly different from yours because while yours was sort of you actually imagining a sort of like new iteration of this, mine was actually a novelization of an existing comic run by Ta-Nehisi Coates between, I think 2018, The Intergalactic Empire of Wakanda, which is its own specific run. And I think one of the first things I was tasked with, which sort of comes into your question, is they asked me to novelize what existed in the comics, but there were spaces in between that they wanted me to also fill. And we had like long conversations about what that looks like, where are we drawing from, what are we extending, expanding on. And we had a lot of room to bring in new things. And like my first instinct was to draw from other spaces that you typically wouldn't expect to see in the Black Panther universe. And so this book, therefore, almost in existing does that job of saying, there's already this Black Panther lore, it already touches all these multiple places, how can we do that even more? How can we bridge the roots of the Black Panther figure, the lore of Wakanda as a nation? In this particular iteration is a spacefaring Wakanda, so there's a sort of almost alternate Wakanda existing in intergalactic space. And there was just a lot of room to play with that, to like draw even more from both sides of, draw from continental lore, from continental history. Ta-Nehisi Coates had already even done that in the comics, but I was able to still go that step further and also do the same thing by drawing from, what existed in the sort of African-American iterations or imaginations of speculative realities and pull that again as well into this far-flung intergalactic empire. I think having this exist in a third space allowed that freedom to actually pull from these two places. And I think there was also, prior to this one, there was an anthology of Black Panther short stories that we're also on, and that one is another good. It did what you were explaining about anthologies, where you managed to pull all these varied imaginations that have different touch points. Mine was set in. My short story, for instance, in that Black Panther universe was set in Lagos, Nigeria, but the story that followed mine was set in Oakland. It could be anywhere. And because all these artists were sort of writing from the sort of like locus points, the imagination that carried that this shared world was also kind of very local in that manifestation in each short story. And so, yeah, that's one of the good things I've really liked about working in that property, being able to sort of take it from whatever it is and sort of situate it in a very specific space or a specific imagination of it, and it still fits because it still deals with similar things that cut across. Yeah.
I wanted to just say that idea that every writing of Black Panther is a kind of rewriting of Black Panther, which is to say it is a rewriting of American history in a way, because when you think of who started Black Panther, and so then you get African-American writers who are kind of rewriting this thing that white writers wrote. But then when you come to the property, you're thinking about Nigerian-born writer rewriting what an African-American had written about Africans, which white people had written about. I mean, it just goes on and on. And so I was just thinking about that idea that Black Panther, of all the things, becomes this space for diasporic writing, you know. Anyway, so it had me back to you again then. What was your experience writing? You know, I have multiples of you because you've written a Black Panther novel and you've written Black Panther stories. So what was that experience like coming to that property?
First of all, I used to sell the comic book in an independent Black bookstore, so that was my first experience.
You've done everything.
No, I mean, I love the word, so, you know, I'm going to go where the kindred spirits are, and bookstores are where it's at, right? But the whole thing about writing the stories for Tales of Wakanda, so that was edited by Jesse Holland, and Daniel Darrell Jerry's here. He has this great story in there as well called Rites of Passage. Mine was called Heart of a Panther. And the thing that I was so interested in doing when I pitched the story was, wouldn't it be interesting to have the Black Panther come across the ocean and visit where I'm from, you know, which is the Mississippi Delta, where, you know, some of the children of the diaspora were taken, you know. And what if the heart-shaped herb or a seed of it was planted in that rich, fertile land? And what would it do? What would the people there do? And I saw it as a protective force for the people. And I imagine a place where, of course, you have Klansmen and others who are constantly trying to tear down what these African Americans have built, you know, whether we think of Tulsa and all the other riots that happened across the country. This place was indestructible because they had not only they had unity, but they had a supernatural and a spiritual weapon that came from their ancestors directly connected to Wakanda. And that was a lot of fun. I got to play with the animals and the giant mosquitoes and, and other kinds of creatures and stuff, and have the Black Panther wrestle with everything, and also, you know, have a sense of, okay, our it's not just us in this gated community that's Wakanda, but we have lineage that goes out beyond the continent. And what is our responsibility to them? What is their responsibility to us? And how do we build collaborative forces across those disparate times and lineages? So that was a lot of fun to play with that. And then I did a comic as well in the Marvel's Legends series. The World Is Not Ready, where I got to play with Black Panther and Storm, because they always felt like they should be in love, they should be together. I did not like that their marriage ended so quickly. I know that it's been picked back up in a very interesting way, to say that. I don't know who's on the throne right now for Wakanda, but I got to play with their grandchildren. So that was a lot of fun. But, you know, my novel was also a novelization. I was novelizing the original, the first graphic novel, which is Panther's Rage, that Don McGregor did, right? And, you know, like Suyi said, you have to create, fill in the gaps because it was written in another era. So, you know, you're not going to have any DV or anything like that. And I had to create new characters. And then Marvel was very, very cool and flexible about creating new characters to help it make sense for a 21st century audience in an interesting way. So, yeah. I
would just say, too, quickly on both of your work, something that stood out to me that I didn't think about enough going in was how much when you all write novels, the inner thoughts that you all do that they don't do is you just don't have the room in a comic book. Yeah. And so just you all spent a lot of time on the inner thoughts, and I was like, oh, wow, it was like a whole nother world that I did not expect going in. I was gonna even back out just a little bit and just ask you to say, like we're here now and it feels very easy to be here, But my sense is it's not often, or let's say not enough, that we have these spaces where people are actually talking about Black American writers, African American writers, and African writers in the same space. So I don't know, we're talking about speculation. Speculate, why is that? Why don't we have more gatherings like a gathering like this one? What prevents that?
I mean, that's
What is the secret to life?
Yeah. That's a big one. I mean, I could start by sort of putting myself in the position that I occupy now. So I came here. I flew here yesterday from Ottawa in Ontario, which is where I live. Prior to that, I've been sort of privileged to be able to exist in multiple other spaces. That's kind of where I've met some of the people who are here, but also part of the organizers. I think there are big questions. There are big fundamental structural questions of things like access and things like privilege and things like just structural impediments that make it difficult in the first place. But outside of that, then there are also, prior to this, the panel before Alexis was talking about having so if existing as a writer, as an African American writer, speculative writer in America is itself a charged existence, right? That requires sort of a constant battle. Right, you were talking about even recognizing the speculative nature of the work that already exists is even in itself a battle. So you're spending all this time and you're working with this, and then there's she described it as a third limb, right, which I found was a very useful metaphor that you don't know what to do with, because it's like, and then you have this other speculation that's coming out of a space that's kind of like. You notice some of the overtones and notes in it, but you don't quite always necessarily have the same picture at the end. And then the question is, well, what do I do with that? So there's a question of sort of trying to interpret something in a language that sounds like you understand the language, but you can't really translate it, if this makes sense. Which I found fascinating as she was saying it, because sometimes it's the same in the other direction. I grew up in Nigeria, and I've read a lot of Octavia Butler, and Nalo Hopkinson, and I would read it. I recognize something here, but it looks different in a way I can't quite explain, and I don't have the language for it. But the only way I can have the language for it is ending up in a space like this and having these discussions, and then being able to say, oh, now I see what that is. Now I teach literature classes in Introduction to Literatures of African and African Diaspora, or the spectrum of Afrocentric futurisms, right? Afrofuturism, African futurism, whatever. And one of the first things I do is that situation. I lay out all the works and I say, okay, look at these works. These works exist on a spectrum. They have different touch points. They come from different loci of identity, geography, history, etc. What are they saying, and where are the points of overlap, and where are the points of difference, and how do those points of difference even signal to something larger that we should be looking at? So I guess what I'm saying is, for me, why doesn't it happen? I think it's that there's discomfort in those points of difference, but I think it should be quite the opposite. The discomfort should be, outside of the structural challenges, the discomfort over the points of difference, I think of them as opportunity instead. I think that there's opportunity there to have better, deeper conversations like this, as opposed to that being like a barrier to being able to find points of connection and overlap. So I think there's discomfort. And then, of course, there's a third bigger thing of fighting the larger infrastructure and institution that you're fighting against at the same time. So it's like, how do you reconcile these disparate forces pushing at you? It's a long road, I think. But I think we've already started doing that work. You know, Sheree's anthology, Africa Reason, is a good example of that, trying to do that work, and I would say succeeding, because I would say that anthology has succeeded in opening some of those doors. That's my thinking.
I think the thing that we have in common is a colonial language, right? So that's part of it, right? When you talk about Black speculative fiction and then the African speculative fictions, right? There's also this constant, I wouldn't say discomfort, but a contending forces of dealing with perception, right? So if you're not socially together, right, then you're not always going to be artistically together, right? And so, for example, we're just now having conversations that I feel like we should have had, like people should have before they even arrive in America. People come to America and they don't know very much about American history, and they don't know anything about Black American history. And so there's this flatness when we talk about Black culture with an S. There's Black cultures, Black cultures. We're from the Mississippi Delta, but that culture is related to the Creole cultures of Louisiana and Mobile, Alabama. We have cultures in the Mississippi Delta that's connected to the Gullah Geechee cultures, right? Who were able to hold the most African retentions in their language and food. Then you have the whole cultures, which most people are just discovering from Beyonce's Cowboy Carter album, but there are cowboys in Mississippi, cowboys in Tennessee, cowboys in Arkansas, all across Texas, all the way up to Brooklyn, New York, all right? So there's that, because they also came, those who were taken from across the ocean brought those skills with them. I mean, there's so many different cultures that I'm not even going to talk about the Afro-Indigenous cultures. So there's like this flatness that comes like, this is Black American culture, and it becomes hip hop, But every distinctive American music you know of came from Black culture. Black people in America created every single genre, including bluegrass, including punk, including the Nirvana, alternate stuff. So there's like a lack of understanding, and it becomes kind of this weird thing, like, well, we're this, we're that. And then there's, on the other side, people have these other stories, because we're all told stories about each other, right? And those stories are incorrect, and they're not rooted in realities, right? So you have to listen and say, okay, there isn't a flat Africa, right? There are, 54 countries, some principalities, right? And in those countries, there are many different cultures, right? And languages. So we're not even getting to experience all the imagination from these African nations because of the language. Like, they're happening in root languages, but they're not always translated into English, and they always don't have that access. You're able to publish. We're just now getting these doors open where Africans can write stories that go beyond, I was a child soldier, or stories beyond trauma, right? Stories beyond the Biafra War, or what have you. Stories beyond Rwanda, right? Or apartheid. They can tell these other kinds of stories. Publishers are opening up. And African publishers beyond the continent are publishing stories as well. This table is full of some great work as well. So I think part of it is we're not going to have the conversations if we're not even socializing in that way. And it has to be beyond the street festival. And it has to be beyond the film festival, even though those are great spaces to interact. And I think politically, we have to do a lot more collaboration and sharing, not just on these shores, because these shores, it's always been fraught. Those who've been here since it was a colony or colonies, we know how difficult it's been in America. We know the stories, which is why we're kind of treated like enemies of the state, because we know them beyond the mask. And I think other people get the mask or a different kind of mask. And so we got to compare notes. We got to compare notes, and then we can imagine and dream, collectively dream, on some African futures that really reflect the places that we want to be as peoples in the future, right? Without holding on to all that baggage of miscommunication, misunderstanding of the past. When I did Dark Matter, I knew Nady, because Nady had sent me a story for a literary journal I had done called Anansi Fiction of the African Diaspora. And I know Peter Kalu. I knew of Ben Okri because he was a writer of my heart, but I didn't think he'd thought of himself as a science fiction writer. There are other writers that I thought of as well as like definitely speculative writers. When I met Andrea Hairston, Andrea knew all the playwrights. So she can tell me all of the African women playwrights who use speculative fiction, speculative techniques in their work. And I just thought, oh, the world is much bigger, than what our genre would say. And one thing I'd like to remind some of these young writers, don't spend energy fighting each other and trying to be the only one standing, the last man standing, the Highlander of the group, because they don't want any of us in these spaces. They don't want any of us in these spaces, and we've had to work hard for all of us to be able to get these stories out. So collaborate, work together, look out for each other, do right by each other, and keep imagining on the page and beyond the page so that we can get there. Because that's what the art is for me. It's like having young people have that representation on the page and then saying, okay, this is where they stop. I'm going to start my story here. I'm going to start my imagining here. When I was able to start reading more African writers, I said, all right, now I'm getting to the heart of something, you know what I mean? I can hear it, I can taste it, I can smell the spice, I can feel the energy. Oh, this is how technology is perceived. Oh, this is what they're innovating over here. This is what it looks like over here. Oh, this is very American. This is not gonna rock over here. You know what I mean? And so we need all of these voices to come out,
No, the collaboration is really well taken, and I appreciate you saying it, because I was thinking about it. I was just looking at your acknowledgments. And because I read comic books, it was fascinating to read a novelist mentioning these comic book editors. And so it had me thinking about, I know both of you are like, when you're working with a comic book property, there's certain things you can't do, certain things you can do, and like you said, getting permission to do the characters. So I'm just sitting up here now, and I was like, God, I wish we could open up the properties of, I don't know, Toni Morrison. Like had some experts who was like, okay, you can do this and can't do that with that, because there's so many of the stories you wish you could see extended in the same way that this thing called Black Panther is extended. It's just something that's going on there with those kinds of things. You're right, too, on the collaboration or where it happens. To me in the classroom, as a teacher, it seems like what we're presenting students with, which becomes challenging in and of itself with attention spans going down, but it seems like that has to do with something as well. So,
I was... In fact, in thinking about that collaboration, I was thinking about one of the first books I usually teach in my Afrocentric Futurism classes, Octavia Butler's Wild Seed. And it's one of the lesser known of that Patternist series of 5 books. And also generally because people mostly know Parable of the Sower and Kindred, etc. But Wild Seed, funny enough, the reason I actually teach it is because in the Patternist series, she has this technologically advanced sort of people, right, that have developed over time in a speculative time different from ours. But she then goes back and writes a prequel, almost to say, well, this is how these people come about. This is their origin story. And the origin story, it turns out, is actually starts from West Africa. And this was Octavia Butler writing this in 1980, right? She published this book in 1980. So that work has a long history. That work of collaboration has a long history, because when she wanted to do that and she needed to have that information, one of the first places she reached out to was Chinua Achebe's Things Fell Apart. That became the root text for a large part of Wild Seed as a novel in that Patternist series. In fact, for those who don't know, like that book is about 2 immortals of African heritage, one from West Africa and Igbo land, and the other from who's a Cushite, right, from northern. And they both become the seed, sort of like the seed of that sort of peoples that exist later in the future in the other books. But the whole point of them is they leave generations and generations and they birth these many peoples on the African continent, in the diasporas, all over the place. That's the basis. But the thing is, a large part of that book takes place in Igbo land, and she went through great lengths. Even in her interviews, you can hear her talk about the depths to which she went to make sure she represented the plurality of that lived experience in Igbo land correctly in 1980, right? This is her doing this work so far back. So I feel like that attention, investment is one that like we sort of owe as artists and, as you said, as social peoples. When she was doing that work, she reached out to Chinua Achebe himself to actually make sure that she had these, details correctly. And then, of course, the other parts of the story take place in New York and Louisiana predominantly. But like, even I, reading this now in 2025 with my students, right, who probably don't know whether this representation is correct or not, I was very impressed with the rendering. Not just impressed that like she did the work, but I could see her investment in keeping that connection honest and keeping that collaboration strong from the beginning, right? And I think like that's what I personally aspire to. That's what I hope to do when I'm actually writing, not just in its properties, but also just generally, right? I want to be able to maintain like honest collaboration across the board and make sure that, years from now, people are reading this and saying, yes, this is an honest rendering. It has all the pluralities, it has all the complications, and it is a true representation of the lived reality that I'm trying to represent. And I think that's what we should sort of aspire to across the board.
I was just going to say co-sign on Wild Seed. I know Octavia Butler's written many novels, and one of the things I always critique African-American literature scholars, we'll just tell people to read everything as we should. But I love to get on stage and say, but this is their best work. Wild Seed is her best novel. And I mean, you'll get... Octavia Butler people fight you because I know they love Kindred, they love so, but I just love to say that. I know. But I just love Wild Seed, and now you give me even more reasons to like it. So thank you.
Yeah, and then keep in mind there, people here from Igbo land. Like we have the People Could Fly. Like they literally kept their heritage with them. And she is one of those writers who, in terms of world building, absolutely did deep research. I mean, she got on a bus and rode across America to go to Baltimore to do the research to write Kindred. She went to the Amazon forest to do research for her novels. And that's what we do as writers. You have to get us out of the research hole, right? Sometimes we're down in that deep space area, and you have to come up for air. But also having people who keep you honest, talking to people from the communities, having them read over your shoulder, read the whole manuscript, and also taking heed to what they suggest, right? Not expecting them to rubber stamp everything that you do. That's very important as well in terms of world building. Going to the places if you can, right? Being there. And also reading, not just the research, because that's the thing. We talk about research where we're all reading almost the same research because a lot of it is European, right? So we're all reading the same research, but unless you have grandparents who are time travelers, or who are immortal, your grandmom is not telling you everything, right? So we're all also doing some research, but also looking at the scholarship that comes from the continent by Africans themselves, and also keeping abreast of that, right? Creating those alerts where you're getting the articles and things like that, and keeping aware of what your peers are doing, right? Is also important. When I was writing the Black Panther novel, they didn't have the wonderful atlas book that they have now, or the cookbook and all the other things, or the training, the training book. So I had to piece it together from the comics, right? And we couldn't use the cinematic universe, so we couldn't use Marvel Cinematic Universe. That's one thing. We were doing the literary part, the books. That's a totally different timeline. There are characters that you can't mention. I had Black Panther's mother, and they were like, "Nah, she's still alive over here. You can't mention that." Storyline. And so I had to piece together and create new spaces. So I created my own map with the new places in it. And so we're looking at geography where the place becomes a character almost in the storytelling. That's a big part of world building. Languages, people who really get into language. Anybody loves, yes, I know Cameron does. Getting into the language of things is a lot of fun. And if you're doing world building that deals with any African, countries, you have a wealth of language, right, to draw upon and the layers. So if you're a native speaker, you know you can really just go with that, right? The funny thing that's interesting, if you look at the book that Dr. Susanna Cooper just published, Positive Obsession, the biography of Octavia E. Butler, you will find that some of the characters in Wild Seed, she had their names and their outlines written when she was a child. And as a child, right? And when she was doing this research and talking to Chinua and everything, it dawned upon her the synchronicities of her research from her childhood, that she kept the fires of her imagination going all through her life, through poverty, before she got the MacArthur Award, like the first in the science fiction genre to get it, and all these things. She was already in the right area because the names matched, right? One name meant sun, and what was the other name? The other name meant some woman or something. So it fit her characters perfectly, and she did not know that. She didn't know that. So I like to think that the ancestors spoke to her, whispered to her as a child that she would be great and tell these stories. But it worked out, right? Yeah.
I love how we've come in a circle with Octavia Butler. Before I see our time and we get into questions from the audience, but I did want to just note something that had happened in one of my classes, well, it was actually my office hours. I had just happened to be working on a list of writers, and I had them up on the screen in my office, and an undergraduate came through, and I just thought out of that, I said, hey, what do you see here? And the undergraduate said, oh, I see, based on the name, said you have a list of African writers. I said, okay. Later, a grad student came on, had that same list up. And this grad student, I have to say, African-American. And I said, hey, what do you see here? And she looked, and she said, oh, you have a list of Nigerian writers up. All right. Next, I had another grad student come. And I have to say that this student is from Nigeria. And I said, what do you see here? And she looked, and she said, oh, you're messing with me. She said, she said, I'm Yoruba, and you only have Igbo writers up there. So anyway, it was just interesting how this same list can be read in multiple ways depending on who and where you're from. Questions from you all. I think she's going to bring your microphone. Oh, me? No? Yes, she's going to bring you the microphone.
TT's bringing you.
Mic check. Oh, that's First, thank you for your time. Second, you've been talking about people who we really should be reading. If there's somebody who's doing something really good work right now, who's on the continent, who we should be reading, I'd like to get a name if possible, and also someone else, who is known by other African writers, particularly Nigerian writers. I think it'll be a little bit easier to get to because we speak English, who we should be going back to.
Oh my God, the first name, you never ask an editor that. It's like asking about children, right? But the first thing that jumped out to me was Klo Tomasi. Yeah. Is it Womb City?
Klo Tomasi, right?
Yeah, is the name of the novel? It's
Womb City.
Womb City. Read that. I enjoyed it so much.
It's a good book.
Yeah, I think she's a fine writer. Read anything by Andrea Hairston. Gosh, there's so many great...
Archangels of Funk is on Ursula Le Guin list right now, right?
What'd you say?
Archangels of Funk.
Archangels of Funk is a great one, or Master of Poisons if you're interested in fantasy. And that's amazing world building in that. Yeah, it's like we have so many writers.
I'm thinking, I was thinking about your question about who we should be going back to. There are two writers I usually teach in my that don't get as much airplay, not even in Nigeria, but also outside. So the first one is the Palm Wine Drinker, okay, by Amos Joala. So that I think is one. There's a specific time period of works that have come out from particularly West Africa, but specifically Nigeria because I'm Nigerian, that I think were formative for how we started to think about speculative work afterwards, especially in what I'm thinking of as like the internet age, right? And I think Amos Tutuola is one of that sect that didn't get his flowers because of that time. So I think like having him getting his flowers now is very useful. The other is Cyprian Quincy, right? Who wasn't. So let me put it this way. At the time when the English novel as a literary form made its way into many of the post-independence nations, a lot of the stories were about, they were really about like, struggle and like the idea of like writing back against this narrative of Africa or like African nations and peoples. But what set Cyprian Quincy's work apart is that he sort of eschewed that and decided to do work that was representative of like the lived reality of living in a city that had just sort of that was still a bit setting itself up. So his work has this urban gritty feel that's very, it's very, very different in texture. And I read a lot of it when I was growing up, and now I try to always squeeze one of his shorter texts. They're very like focused on, they're very thriller-like. They have a very strong sense of like pushing the boundaries of narrative and the form and the style of the novel. His works are shorter than usual, than the typical, et cetera, et cetera. So Cyprian Quincy is another person I think going back to is very useful.
Sutton E. Griggs would be great. Definitely check out his work. Martin Delaney, we consider him our first Black nationalist. These are people who were either self-publishing or publishing in Black independent presses, in the newspapers, serially, before Stephen King did it here, and maybe before Charles Dickens even, some of them. There's, I mentioned Peter Kalu earlier. Who else would be really great? Do you, like you said, just to reach back? They keep finding more W. Du Bois stories, so who knows, they might find something else. I'm almost curious to look at all the Black sociologists because they were looking at our world. Remember how Black women sociologists really gave us context during the Black Lives Matter era early? A lot of them are creative. And so even though that we think of like the soul of Black folks and these other like big, important works, they were also creatively exploring the same ideals and questions. So I feel like if we went back through their archives, we may find other gems like that as well. So we never know. And playwrights, that is a place that has not really been explored to the degree that I think it could be in terms, because think about it, playwrights are always dealing with fabulism. They don't have the same constrictions that literary realms have, they're not gonna, no one's gonna turn up their nose and say, oh, you have a science fiction, theme in your play. It's natural. It's, the natural way of storytelling. So definitely looking at our plays, in particular, even, the Black arts movement like Amir Baraka, his work is very speculative, definitely. Ishmael Reed, Ntozake Shange, go into those works and lean in with a different lens to see what it gives you. And Henry Dumas, Ark of Bones. Yeah. Or Dumas, if you want to be fancy. But he was from Arkansas.
Hello. So I'm from Somalia. In Somalia, we're known, well, still are, kind of, a nation of poets. So my question is, I feel like a lot of African countries who have gone through things like Somalia, the civil war, and the Islamic regime in a lot of places. And I like have a lot of friends from Rwanda. And we always, like, our parents who have gone through those moments never want to talk about it. So as writers, how do we tell stories if we can't be told the stories? Does that make sense? Yeah, because my mom would never talk about the Civil War. Grandparents, same thing. My friends who are from Rwanda, during that, their parents, same way. So yeah, as a writer, I still read Somali poems. We have them in our songs, and they're beautiful, but it's just no one. I feel like Somalia has lost that touch because of everything. And also, the Western world kind of tarnishes certain African countries because of that reason too. So yeah.
That's one of the where
That's a tough question.
I only just wanted to say that the toughness of it, but also just wanted to acknowledge the importance of that. Just as somebody who studies African American literature, Black American literature, I will say that slavery, I mean, we almost take it for granted now because you can go find so many books on slavery, but there was a moment where that wasn't the case, where people weren't actively writing about slavery. Toni Morrison, though, writes Beloved in 1987, and in some ways reshifts all of this thing we call African American literature. I mean, people just were not talking about it the way we talk about it now without that moment in 1987, which is followed up by a group of critics celebrating the work in the New York Times. So I just wanted to say it's a tough question, but it's almost like you need that moment and need to keep writing on it to break through. But
I found that my grandparents told me things that they didn't tell my parents. And it may be the distance of time, right? You know, when their parents, especially with their first child, they're the first time being parents. And each child is born into a different family because your parents are different when you're born, right? And you change the dynamic as well, right? But my grandparents told me things about their lives in Mississippi in particular. They're from the same county as Fannie Lou Hamer, Ruralville, Mississippi, Sunflower County, and they witnessed a lot. And my grandfather would tell me things, and I would go and tell my father, and he would say, "What?" Like he didn't know why they moved from Mississippi to Tennessee, how they ended up in Memphis. I found out how they got to Mississippi, right? And I think sometimes being the grandchild opens you up to a special space that is not reserved for the child, right? Because they're in the business of living and surviving and taking care of their children as primary parents. But as a grandparent, then they get to do a lot of the fun things maybe, and a lot of the heavy lifting has been done because you come from their great children already. And so they can come to it with a reflection. I think going through it through the art, through the music and song, generates memory in a different kind of way, and it makes it a safer space to talk about it. So it's not necessarily autobiography, but it's in the realm of the arts, right? And so then they can tell you a song, and it doesn't feel as if you are implicating them personally, because who knows what horrors they have witnessed, and who knows what tough choices they had to make, and things that had to be done or not done, right? But putting it in the realm of storytelling, in the realm of art, in the realm of poetry and dance, and those kinds of things can open up that space for you to capture what needs to be said in ways that only you can tell it, because you're that generational force that can do it. Yeah, that's an important question.
I'm even going to go one step further and try to sell you on speculative fiction, right? Which is that I think that's partially what speculative fiction exists for. I think that's one of the things it can do, because what you're really doing when you're engaging in speculative work is taking something that where a direct engagement either itself is not. Maybe it's hard. Maybe it's difficult. Maybe it's quite challenging. Maybe it's hard to access, etc. For whatever reason. But then you take it and then you isolate it in a very specifically different context that immediately makes it sharper or starker. Right? It's like you take something and put it against a very different background. Where before it could get lost and in the murk, now it suddenly stands out. That's what you're doing when you're speculating. So. A good example is, for instance, Tochi Onyebuchi wrote this novel, War Girls, which is really speculative imagination of the Biafra War, for instance, right? But he takes it and puts it in this intergalactic or like this very far-flung technological future, and immediately he can treat some matters that ordinarily he couldn't have treated with a direct one-to-one realist novel because he can do that. Or how a lot of people say learned about the Tulsa Race Massacre by watching Watchmen, which is a completely speculative, TV show, right, limited series. So it's like I think there's a certain obliqueness, or like coming at it from an angle that speculative fiction allows you to, but not just speculative fiction, speculative poetry, or like engaging in storytelling in a realm that allows you to do different things with it. It's why I think a lot of the stories that we have from times of intense trauma almost always carry overtones of, speculative elements to some degree, whether you're looking at how, say, magic realism emerges from Latin American culture. All of these things are that's why they manifest that way, because a direct engagement with that thing is harder. And so you come at it from an angle, and that angle often always employs speculative techniques. So that's how I think is one way you can approach the subjects.
I love that. It makes me think of Alejo Carpentier, the Cuban writer, the historian, who came up with the marvelous reel because he wanted to write a historical book about the Haitian revolutionary independence movement. And when he was doing his research, he realized that their spiritual traditions were so powerful, so much a part of why they were able to succeed in their independence from France, that he realized that the tools that he'd been taught as a historian, the traditional historiography tools, were not enough and didn't do justice to telling that story. And so he reached to what he called the marvelous reel, right? And for anyone who speaks Spanish, how would you say marvelous reel in Spanish? Marveloso realismo? Yes. He started that as a form to tell. Oh, I love that. Realismo magical, to tell the story of Haiti, because it's centered voodoo as the origin and the spiritual force that bound the people who were not afraid to die, right? They were not afraid of death because they had their gods to protect them. And so he had to write outside of the realm of history using what we would call today speculative fiction tools to tell the story in a way that honored those faiths and treated them with respect and not as just magic, right? So there's a place you can do that. And then there's a scientist who, a scholar who did a book called Galileo's Daughter, writing about Galileo, whose daughter did a lot of the math, right? And so there's a point where the historical record begins and it ends, and she lets you know in her book, okay, this is all we know, that we can prove with the evidence, material, culture, whatever, in the world. But then this is where my imagination goes. This is where I speculate on Galileo's daughter, and there's a clear part in the book where she goes into that realm. But there's lots of different structures you could use if you wanted to play with what you do know, and then speculate as an artist, as a creator, on what you don't. And I think that's what writers do in general. What if we answer it in the way we want to? Yeah.
Since we were saying stories, I just got to say, because we just wouldn't be able to pass without doing so. So in the comic book, Black Panther, Intergalactic, Coates just mentions in passing. He says, oh, they were still in the memories of these people. He says that in passing. And then Suyi takes this up in the, oh my God, man, that was just, he developed this whole thing about oral histories and about what it means to try to lose these oral histories and then try to get them back. And everyone in the novel is just struggling to, like, how do you retain this history? But to me, the leap was from Coates just mentioning this thing in passing, and then you taking it and just imagining all the possibilities of when your memories are stolen, and then all the possibilities of what it means to try to just really fight to get them back. And these people start developing. It's an oral history project. So when you're reading a novel and things you don't expect to come across, I didn't expect to come across that, and now it's hard not to think about it. So I appreciate that.
It's very funny. When we started thinking about the novelization, one of the challenges of novelizations is, well, comic runs can go on forever. Novels have to end. So the first question was, where's our starting point? Where's our end point? And I think, so we sort of tried to brainstorm that, but one of the first things I did when I skimmed the issues, I was trying to figure out I was trying to figure out what are they fighting for, right? Because a large part of the comic is like you have all these rebels and then you have the Intergalactic Empire and they're fighting. Why? And I think I wanted to find a thing that they were trying to recover, right? What are they fighting for? And that's why I was able to latch on to the memory. So in the end, my pitch for the book was they're fighting to remake a memory. It's a memory reclamation project. The war is a project for memory reclamation. They have to keep fighting to get bits of this memory that they had that has been taken. Because what happens in the books is that the empire just, once it captures them, it takes their knowledge and memory, sort of like wipes it off and stores it for itself, and then uses all their technological advancements, etc., to actually build their own, to build itself up. So really, the empire had nothing, which is stealing stuff from others and then building itself up. And I could see Coates doing that as an analogy for how America itself is founded, like off the labor, the actual labor of a certain of people, right? And so the question of the whole sort of group fighting, I wanted it to be less about like wars and like spacecrafts and pew 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 in space or whatever. I didn't want that. I wanted to spend more time like in their situation rooms and like what are they talking about. I didn't want them to just talking about like technological stuff. What are they trying to do? What is the aim here? And the aim is that it's memory reclamation. The memory is the point. And one of the things we used to cement that was they didn't have names either. Their names are also erased as part of the memory. So they come out the other end just being, numbers, right? And then they're put in the minds to just mine vibranium, etc. That was the whole theory. So part of the reclamation wasn't just reclaiming collective memory, which was the end game, but also personal memory. What is your name? So in the interim, we started to ask the question, well, what would we call them in the book? And so what they had like sort of like names or handles that they adopted in the interim in order to sort of see them through until they find their actual name. That's what they're trying to do for most of the book. And I guess I was really thinking about how, Coates made a lot of his setup of the story was based on the exact manner in which transatlantic slavery and chattel slavery functioned in terms of it's a project of complete erasure. The point is a project of erasure. And so if the, this intergalactic empire's work is not just to erase, but not just to erase, to take for itself and then use it to build itself, it then becomes hard to defeat something that looks like is a mirror in a sense, like it mirrors themselves back to them, right? It uses their own technologies to then defeat them. So they're struggling against reclaiming their memory, but also reclaiming their sense of self, their sense of identity, all that, etc. So it made, to me, that's the kind of like, I love conflict that looks like that has an internal component of like fighting against something that you're struggling to understand, that you see parts of yourself in, and then you find it hard to actually come up against that thing, etc. I think it's also, I thought it was representative of now, right? We are locked in institutional systems that we see ourselves in, but we also have to fight against at the same time. How do we do that? Those questions come up so many times. There are people on one side who are like, burn it all down. And then there are people who in the same room who are like, maybe we take a more level-headed approach, etc. I wanted all those voices as a way to think about our current moment now, because these are similar questions that we're tangled with.
Just be loud.
It's on.
Suyi, were there any ideas in your own writing that took extra time to translate for an American audience?
In this particular book?
Yes.
So I was. So this is the thing. This part, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that I trust that the audience is smart. I trust that they can pick up what I'm putting down without having to necessarily feel like I need to translate. I think people who come to the work know that they have to do that bit of work. And I think that's okay and normal. So I would say I typically don't even try as much as to like translate, but rather maybe to make the climb less steep. So I try to like present sufficient context for what I'm doing, and then trust the reader, I guess. Luckily for me as well, though, Ta-Nehisi Coates had already done he had done a lot of work. And when I was writing, he had these notes that they sent to me that he had made in not just like thinking about the world, but also where he pulls these expressions that he's used and terms from. Funny enough, he's also pulled a lot of them from spaces that I recognize, terms he used for the spacecrafts. He names all these spacecrafts with African names from East Africa, West Africa. He has names for the soldiers, etc. He has all these terms, but those terms have a certain kind of relevance in the lived reality, like he's borrowing from. So I didn't feel like I needed to then explain, because then I'm like, well, first of all, if you'd already read some part of Black Panther, you kind of knew what this was. So I didn't feel like I needed to go further. So yeah, I would say I tried not to really do that, but I think that's just general practice for me. I try to trust the reader to sort of take steps forward, and I take just a couple more to sort of meet them in the middle, and I try not to translate too much, but to actually leave a lot of room for them to actually come to. Yeah.
So one thing that we get, right, when I think about African American literature, when I think about African literature, right, one thing that we get is, that I think that I would like to hear more talked about, is the engagement of the African spiritual systems. And that would be spiritual systems that come from the continent, right? As like Yoruba or what have not, or the African spiritual systems that were created here, right, in the United States, or not just in the United States, Caribbean, wherever, right? We talked about like the Haitian Revolution, right? I know y'all talked about the Haitian Revolution, right? And history tells us that really it was voodoo, right? Voodoo was one of the things, really was the main glue that united, right, the people in Saint-Domingue, right, and put them on the same page so they could free themselves and oust the French and all the other armies that came and tried to conquer them, right? So how does your work engage African spiritual systems, and how does your work help to recreate them? How are you writing like the new mythologies, right, that speak to us and sort of like translate the world to us today?
Oh, okay. Oh, that's a. First of all, when you start off with the spirituality, all the ones that I'm aware of just start running through my mind like code. It's so much. But then there's also this move where, what is it? Nadia Okorafor is talking about jujuism, right? And so you have people, when you meet people from the continent, they're like, they don't really deal with it because they're like, that's darkness, right? So we look at it from a different perspective than maybe some people on the continent do, right? They're trying to get away, and we're reaching out, right? Or we leaning into, right? Because we don't necessarily see it as darkness, right? We see it as weaponry, spiritual technology that keeps us ahead of the forces that would suck us in, right? So I'm doing my research and everything. A lot of the work that I'm exploring comes from family, lived experience, what have you, the tradition of hoodoo, which is a version of or a combination of faiths, right? But when I go back and I look down the line, I know takes me to Kikongo, it takes me to Congo, right? Or it takes me to Benin, right? It takes me to these very specific places. And as I travel, I see how the people carried their spiritual traditions with them and how they reimagine them in the places they were in. So it looks very different in Haiti, right? It looks very different in Bahia, looks different in Cuba, right? If I go to Mexico, it's looking different over on that Gulf Coast over there, right? And when you go into the Mississippi Delta, it looks different. And when I'm in the islands, when I go to the Sea Islands, Sapelo Island, if I go to the Carolinas, if I go into Florida, it's looking different, right? But it's the same people. It's the same peoples. So I think part of as you say, the reimagining of it is trying to come to it with respect and not with the superstition that other cultures have laid upon it, right? Because my family was hidden in plain sight. They were going to a church going to the church. They are Christians. They are Baptists. But then there's other things happening that's not in that Bible. And there's other things that's happening that's not a part of the scripture necessarily. And that comes from spiritual traditions that were at least 150 years old in America. Before they were converted to Christianity, they had their own religions for 150 years, right? And so when you study books like the slave religion book, the great classic book on slave religion, right? You realize that some of the African missionary Episcopal churches, AME, some of the African Methodist churches, all these other kinds of traditions of Christianity are affected by that 150 years. And it's in the practice. They're very different from Quakers. They're not sitting in silence and solitude and speaking as you've been to Quaker, yes, so you know what I mean, standing up and maybe sharing a thought and then sitting back down in silence. That's not how it's looking in these other churches, right? There's a rhythm, the drum is there, right? The drum, the percussion in the hands, in the shout, in the call and response, right? In the ring shout, right? All these things come from 150 years of them practicing religions that go across the waters deep into their roots in Africa, and they did not forget them. And they're in the music, they're in the songs, they're in the rhythms, they're in the food, right? And they're in the birthing practices, they're in the burial practices, and they are in so many other cultural values and heart. I went to a wake very recently for a family member who is Haitian, and I knew that she was very deep into her Voodoo tradition in Miami and had gone back home to pull those roots from her family because she was brought here as a small child to America. And so she was raised by another mother, but her biological mother was still, in Haiti. And when she came back, she was changed, right? And she began to do a lot of scholarship and research and everything and created a cultural center. So she's doing very beautiful work and writing it down in her books. But when I went to the wake, I was surprised to walk in, and instead of just seeing a beautiful photograph of her, I saw the cosmogram from the Kikongo there. It's dead center, because that's the spiritual paradigm for the living and the dead and all the elemental forces that we are so beholden to on this planet and that we're supposed to respect and love and be good stewards of. She recognized that even though voodoo was her main tradition, she had gone back to Sierra Leone, she had gone back to Africa and found the sources. And that was honored at her passing because she recognized for her, that's where her spirit would go as a force to continue guiding her family from the other side. That was a powerful thing to see. And so that's the kind of world-building research. You take the real and you understand it and you try to respect it and you try to infuse your work with those traditions. One, so that new generations don't forget. Two, so they're not brainwashed to believe that it is darkness only, or that it is something that should be shunned. Three, that so it becomes a tool for the imagination, but also a tool for personal healing, perhaps, right? And four, so that it is a record. There is a record of it. It's not a historical record necessarily, but it is an artistic record. So that's what I tried to do with 9-Bar Blues, the stories in that, which were mostly stories inspired by music. And if you know what the blues are, then you know what the 9-bar is, right? That's that extra, ta-da. That's that extra fire. And then with Mojo Rhythm, which is my new work, absolutely hoodoo is all through that. All those spiritual beliefs are in that, so.
I was gonna, when you mentioned the ring shot, I was gonna propose that. Well, two authors. First one is P.J. Lee Clark, whose novella titled Ring Shout actually does some of this work because there's a lot going on there. The premise of the novel is that it's about this woman who's like sort of a demon hunter, but the demons she hunts are called Ku Kluxes. And they're this white hooded demon. It's a very fascinating novella. It's really great. But what was particularly interesting is that the title of the novel, Ring Shout, actually comes from the ring shout of, and he, P.J. Clark infuses a lot of like Gula Geechee, like chants and recitations and like canticles in the work. Very interesting. He does something very similar in the Black God's drums. Which also does that, but from a different space or point of view. He has Trinidadian heritage, so that makes complete sense in the way he does this work that touches different points. The other person I was going to mention is Nalo Hopkinson. Brown Girl in the Ring is sort of the quintessential work that does that looks at, sort of like speculatively enters the fray. And I particularly like that one because it actually starts out as a sort of dystopian Toronto, and then very immediately, almost like because you start expecting what we think is the typical imagination, right? Dominant imagination of what dystopia means, she sort of immediately blows it up open and sort of allows you to suddenly see all these various manifestations of that, including her, various spiritualisms that she could infuse in that. A recent novel that does something very similar is Wole Talabi's Shigidi and the Birth Head of Obalufon. Does the same thing, but instead it has to do with these deities, these West African deities, doing a heist in a British museum for artifacts. Does something very similar as well, but the deities are operating as a corporation, so it's a very unique way of tackling some of these spiritualities. But as you said, creating an artistic record, I think, is very important because that's how I know, for instance, about these things, by reading these books. That's how I come into contact and then do some further research, etc. So an artistic record, I think, is a very useful way of putting it.
And then the ring shout is the cosmogram, and that cosmogram is in voodoo as well. So there is like an Afro-diasporic connection to all of that work. And I guess the Nalo Hopkinson book that I love is Midnight Robber. If you like science fiction and you're interested in like what might the descendants of Caribbeans who colonized the planet, what would that planet look like perhaps? And what if there are two, a shadow planet and another one, and it's run by a kind of like an artificial assistant maybe, a kind of ancestral intelligence. That's like the granny nanny tech, right? Nanotechnology that is rooted in the great revolutionary figure of Nana, right? What would that look like in a kind of Jamaican, Trinidadian, Canadian space? So Midnight Robber is a wonderful, wonderful novel to check out, and it has a lot of spiritual things in it as well.
Hey, thank you all so much for your attention. Can we give our two featured folks a hand?